Hi, History Through Film, and welcome to U3L4 Basics of World War II, Part 3. This is Miss Corey, by the way. All right, learning targets describe the social, political, and economic causes and main turning points of World War II, describe the causes and consequences of the Nazi Holocaust, including the effects of the Nazi regime's war against the Jews and other groups. There's a lot to talk about today, so I'll talk pretty fast, but do let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you watch this Ed puzzle and answer the questions in blue text. All right, today we're going to focus on Europe. We'll talk about Japan at the very, very end. I know we didn't talk about the beginning of Japan yet. So France falls to Germany. So going back into June of 1940, so the war doesn't end until another 5 years from now, but Germany invades France. German forces break through something called the Maginot Line, which is this concrete wall and kind of posts that France builds along the border of France and Germany. Here's a picture of what part of it looks like, so you can kind of see just a bunch of kind of poles sticking out of the earth. So Germany has this really brilliant idea of how to get to France. What they do is they go around the Maginot Line via Belgium. Yep, they just literally went around the wall. So here is a map. Here's Germany right here. Here's France. So more in the solid red area, that's where you have more of the fortified Maginot Line. And then where it's dotted line, it's pretty weak. There's not much there. So Germany's like, oh my gosh, I want to get to France. Oh, I know. I'll just go through Belgium. And that's exactly what they did. So France falls to Germany. So Germany had control of France. The French General Charles de Gaulle, who's this dude here, he flees to London. He then sets up a radio show broadcasting from England. He tells England and France, or he tells the French people to resist the Nazis on radio. The reason why he could do this is because England and France are actually only 40 miles apart at their closest, which isn't that far. But of course, he's saying this to the French people as he's sitting in London. So France fell. Great Britain then had to fight Germany all on their own. Winston Churchill becomes the new prime minister. Prime minister is like the leader of Great Britain, like in the US, we have presidents. There they have prime ministers. So he declared that Great Britain would never surrender. He said, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender. All right, one of the big battles during this was the Battle of Britain. This happened in July and August of 1940. So Great Britain now was the main fighting force against the Axis powers because France was overtaken. So Germany wanted to overwhelm Britain. So Germany has a strategy is what they would do is they would first establish air superiority. So they would send in a bunch of planes over London and then send in ground forces to take London for themselves. But this did not work out for Germany because Britain withstood the German attacks thanks to the Royal Air Force, or the RAF. So the Royal Air Force had this really cool new technology called radar system that helped prepare when and where airplanes and ships were, so they could detect where they were and shoot down those German planes and ships. There's also the London Blitz. This happened in September of 1940. That's where Germans would fly over daily and bomb the city of London. And over 35,000 tons of bombs were dropped on London in just this month. So here's a picture of some of the aftermath. You can just see this building is completely destroyed. There's a bus on top of it. Yeah, a lot. So Germans also attacked other Great Britain cities. And this was a good thing because it allowed the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, time to rebuild the radars and forces. In retaliation, Great Britain did go and fly over Berlin and strike fear into the Germans by dropping bombs on them. So this was the first all-air battle of World War II. It would end in September, and Great Britain would win this battle. So here's another really interesting picture. So to protect themselves, people would sleep down in the subways. So there were three main reasons for Great Britain's victory in the London Blitz. The first was the development of the radar, the second was the skill of the Royal Air Force, and the third was the British government imposed total blackout. So a blackout is when people would have to cover their windows with thick black dark curtains or turn off their lights. So here's a question for you. Why would a blackout help? All right, I'll answer that question in this picture here. So here is a picture of London during a blackout. So you can see here with these buildings, I mean, they're completely dark. All you can see really are the spotlights going up into the sky. This is for the German planes flying overhead to not be able to see the ground, so they couldn't hit specific buildings that maybe were important. Also for the spotlights to be easier to see where the German planes were. Same thing with this picture here. All right, the United States. So at this point, the US is not even in the war yet. We don't join the war until 1941. So the US stays neutral during the first part of the war. FDR, or President Franklin D. Roosevelt, I just call him FDR, by the way, he uses the policy of isolationism, which is when a country isolates itself from other countries' affairs, specifically at wartime. The US passes the Neutrality Acts. This means that the US cannot send arms or weapons to warring nations, and they cannot give loans to warring nations either. Then comes the Lend-Lease Act. So this kind of backs up isolationism a little bit. So this happened in May of 1941, and the US saw that its friend Great Britain was really struggling in the war, especially since France got taken over by Germany. So they decided to make something called the Lend-Lease Act, which reverses some of the Neutrality Act's effects. So the US is now able to provide military aid to Great Britain, but this also indicates that US has sided with Great Britain in World War II. During this time, there was also some secret meetings happening. So President FDR, or President Roosevelt, same guy. Some people like to abbreviate his name to FDR. Some just call him President Roosevelt. Is the same dude. And Churchill, who's this dude here, remember he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, were meeting in secret. And they created something called the Atlantic Charter. So the Atlantic Charter did two things. It was declaring support for free trade among nations and also the right of citizens to choose their own type of government. So the US finally enters the war during Pearl Harbor. So I know a lot of you have learned about Pearl Harbor. The short and sweet of it is that it happened December 7th, 1941. Japan bombs the US military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and this event sparks the US to enter into World War II. All right, now we have the full team of Allied powers. So we had the US, the USSR, and Great Britain. Well, okay, and France, but they kind of gotten taken over by Germany back in 1940, so they're pretty useless at this point. There are other countries in the Allied powers as well. I know we usually just talk about the USSR, and Great Britain, but all of these countries are also in the Allied powers. They are Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. All right, so what is the goal of the Allied powers? It's to fight until the Axis surrender, and the goal was also to fight in North Africa. So there's this whole part of World War II we are not even going to touch, and that is North Africa. Honestly, I don't know much about World War II in North Africa, so we're going to kind of skip over it. Sorry. All right, next let's talk about the Tehran Conference. So this happened in November 1943, so 2 years before the end of the war. So Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill meet in Tehran, Iran, and they discuss the end of the war and the final assault on Germany. This is also when they think of D-Day, which will be a very, very critical piece of information for this unit. Okay, D-Day. This started on June 6, 1944. It was an Allied invasion of Nazi France, so they're trying to get France back. It was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's this guy here. He'll later become a US president. More than 1 million men land on the beaches of France, Normandy being the main section of beach. So there are a lot of hazards during D-Day, including underwater mines, barbed wire, machine guns. It totaled about 10,000 Allied casualties. So casualty is either a death or an injury. So here's more of a zoomed in of the map. So you can see here that the Allies would start in England, and then they would cross the English Channel into France. They would land right here. And these are the 5 main beaches. We have Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Omaha is going to be the big one that you're going to want to remember. So here are some photos of D-Day. As you can see here, these are not the bloody photos. You see service members or soldiers coming out of these little ships that were docked on the beach. They'd have to walk through the water and then walk up into France. Now, most of the time, this was not so simple to do. Typically, these doors would open and they would be greeted by German rifles or machine guns. Here's another kind of view of the inside of the boat going outward. You can see the men had to go through the water and then onto the beaches. There would be German snipers and machine gunnists up here just totally destroying these soldiers. Okay, here's another kind of look at what it looks like. Again, these are like the non-bloody photos. So, take back of France. 3 months after D-Day, Allies have over 2 million soldiers in France. They break through German lines and they eventually take back Paris on August 25th in 1944. Allies keep pushing past France and they finally hit the German border, which leads to something called the Battle of the Bulge. So, this is probably one of the most famous battles in all World War II. Here's the long story short. It's the Allies versus Germany. It lasts 2 months, December 1944 to January 1945. It's Germany's last stand because if Germany does not defend themselves, the Allies are going to come into Germany and take it over. So this happens in Belgium and Luxembourg, right on the border of Germany. The Allies would win and they started to enter Germany itself. So here's a map of what that looks like with the Battle of the Bulge. So you can see that it happens right here where there's kind of like a bulge in the German line. Okay, you see that right there. So eventually, the Allied forces would defeat the Germans. The Germans would then have to retreat back into Germany, and the Allied forces would march right into Germany. So ending of World War II. So the Soviets would retake land from Germany that they stole from the Soviets. The Soviets would enter Berlin in April of 1945. You can see a picture here. Here is a Soviet soldier hanging the Soviet flag over the city of Berlin. In January of 1945, Hitler hides underground. April 28th of 1945, Mussolini is dead by firing squad. April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. Here is a picture of what the inside of Hitler's bunker looked like. Now, of course, this is after the Allies raided it. So here's another picture you can see here of what inside Hitler's bunker looked like. Here is a model of Hitler's bunker that's at one of the German museums. So you can see that it's fairly big. There's lots of little rooms. There's bedrooms or bathrooms. There's more of where the officers would sleep and stuff like that. So May 7th, 1945, Germany finally surrenders. This is known as VE Day or Victory in Europe Day. War in Germany is finally over. But that does not end World War II because Asia is still fighting. Japan is still fighting. Okay, the ending of World War II. So what was the cost? There were 21 million soldiers that were dead. 40 million civilians were dead. 28 million of which were Russian and Chinese. There's also displaced people. So 30 million people in Europe did not really have a home to go back to or a country to go back to. Germans were expelled from the Sudetenland, which we talked about was part of Czechoslovakia, and Poland gets back the land that Germany stole from them. The war cost about $4 trillion total. Economies of the world would slump back into a depression, but it wasn't an economic depression as bad as the 1930s economic depression, but there's still a little bit of a depression. There's also the Potsdam Conference. So this happened in July 1945. It was with the U.S., Great Britain, and the USSR. So FDR, President Roosevelt, had died at this point. So Vice President, now President Truman, takes over. And it is held in Potsdam, Germany, which is right here. So during the Potsdam Conference, President Truman knows that the U.S. has the ultimate weapon, which is an atomic bomb. And that atomic bomb would eventually be dropped on Japan in August of 1945. So Truman demands free election throughout Eastern Europe, But Stalin is very opposed to this. So Stalin, who is the leader of USSR slash Soviet Union slash Russia, is communist, and he knows that if free elections are throughout Eastern Europe, that communism probably is not going to spread, and that's one of his big goals. Is Stalin wants communism to spread. But there were some agreement among these three leaders, so all agreed that Japan had to leave its territories. I know we didn't talk about Japan yet. My apologies. Japan had invaded a lot of China, so they agreed that Japan would have to leave China, and they all three agreed upon something called the Nuremberg trials. So here's a map of Japan and what it took during World War II. So Japan's right here in more of that kind of bright pink red color, and they had taken over all of this area of China as well as parts of Indochina. All right, the Nuremberg trial. So this is a pretty famous trial. What do you know about the Nuremberg trials? If you don't know anything, that's okay. Just say I don't know or something like that. All right, so it was held from 1945 till 49 in Germany, is where Nazis and other Axis powers were put on trial for war crimes for World War II and the Holocaust. There were 22 major war criminals who were tried. 12 were convicted and sentenced to death. 3 were convicted and sent to life in prison, and 4 were convicted to non-life in prison. So, the really important part of the Nuremberg trials is that this trial shows that national leaders can be held responsible for war crimes against humanity. So, again, we didn't really talk about Japan yet. I'm sorry about that, but I'll just talk really briefly of what happened to Japan after the war, especially because they really kind of have a unique scenario because, they're all the way over in Asia versus Europe. So after the atomic bomb drops in Japan in August of 1945, Japan surrenders. They know they cannot best the atomic bomb at this point of time. So August 14th, Japan officially surrenders. It's called the VJ Day or Victory in Japan Day. US military would then occupy Japan. The US government appoints this dude here, whose name is Douglas MacArthur, to control all of Japan's government. Douglas MacArthur began demilitarization, which means the disbanding of the Japanese military. And that is to stop the threat of war again. They couldn't rise up and cause war. And this it plays in effect today, because to this day, Japan is not allowed a military. Kind of. Okay, kind of not allowed a military. They do have something called the Japan Self-Defense Force. It's pretty much a military. They just don't call it a military. Today, there's about 247,000 members. And the occupation of Japan by the United States after World War II is a really big reason why the US has 23 military bases in Japan even today. So here's a map of all those military bases in Japan. So under MacArthur, Japan was to go through democratization, which is where Japan creates a new government and constitution. The Japanese people who created this decided on a constitutional monarchy. So it's kind of like what Great Britain has, and they still have today. It's called a constitutional monarchy. It's where the emperor, or in Great Britain case, the king, Great Britain has like King Charles. So the emperor or the king is more of a figurehead. They really don't have any political power. And the elected officials and prime minister were the ones that had all the government power. And Japan today still has a constitutional monarchy. They still have an emperor. But again, emperor is just really a figurehead. So Japan, it was occupied under US rule until 1952, and it still is kind of to an extent today with all the US military bases. All right, let's wrap this up. Today we learn about Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, Battle of Britain, Atlantic Charter, D-Day, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Battle of the Bulge, Nuremberg trials, demilitarization, and democratization. Next up, you're going to watch U3L5. What is D-Day? That's an ed puzzle. It is worth 5 points. There's 5 questions. I will be grading you on what you get right or wrong. U3L6, D-Day primary source reading. That's primary source reading that you need to read about people who were actually there, answer the questions. And then U3L7, Intro to Saving Private Ryan, which is another one of my videos. All right, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.